We are going to start the recording, and we're getting ready to hand off the projector and everything else, the Zoom, to Chris. You out there, Chris?
I'm here.
Excellent. Welcome.
Thanks. Thanks for inviting me.
Take it away, sir.
Okay, hang on 1 second. Okay, I want to talk today, obviously, about hard seltzer, because that was the topic that was requested. And I'm going to break this talk down into 3 parts. I want to give just a super brief history of hard seltzer and what they, where they came from and what they are. Secondly, a brief overview of the whole process. And then finally, we'll jump back to the beginning and do a more nuts and boltsy breakdown of the whole process. Okay, the story of hard seltzer started with a change in Ttb regulations. The Ttb had a definition of what is beer, or what brewers might call IRC beer, which Internal Revenue, tax code beer, and they changed. This was back in like the early 2010s. They changed the definition from beer to something that's brewed with malt to malt and or an approved malt substitute. Okay? And they listed sugar as a malt substitute. So suddenly a 100% sugar solution could be fermented and commercial breweries could sell that as a beer. Okay, ironically, there's also IRC malt beverages, and those have to contain 25% malt, and they also have to contain hops at a rate of 7.5 pounds per 100 barrels. Okay, so you can brew a beer from straight sugar, no hops at all, a beer, quote unquote, in the Internal Revenue Service's eyes, but a flavored malt beverage has to have 25% malt and 7.5 pounds of hops per 100 barrels. And then, of course, state regulations, they're all over the map. So anyway, somebody said, somebody ignored Jeff Goldblum's talk in Jurassic Park and said, we can do this, let's do it. And so hard seltzers were born. One of the first hard seltzers was made by Bon and Viv way back in 2013 when they were an independent company. They later sold out to Anheuser-Busch. And then the Mark Anthony Group released White Claw in 2016. And then right about 2018, hard seltzers started hitting, finding favor with the marketplace. And between 2018 and 2020, they were booming. They were growing by like 150 to 200% every year. And then they started to hit the skids in 2021. Truly, which is brewed by the Boston Beer Company, actually destroyed millions of cases of Truly in 2021 because they had overbrewed, and for whatever reasons, Jim Koch wasn't willing to sell it at a discount, and so they just bombed it. So anyway, the first hard seltzers, sort of the classic typical hard seltzers, they were clear beverages, they were very fizzy, and they were very lightly flavored. They were typically around 4 to 5% alcohol by volume, usually 90 to 100 calories per serving, and actually most of those calories came right from ethanol. There was very few carbs in the beer. Just for comparison, soda or pop or Coke or whatever you call it in your region, usually 140 to 160 calories per the same size serving, and that all comes from sugar. And then there's beer, of course, which is competing with hard seltzers, and that's usually higher in calories, but how much higher depends on the beer. Standard American Pilsner is generally around 140, 150 calories per 12-ounce serving. So the main selling point on hard seltzers wasn't that they tasted good, because they didn't, or anything. It was that they were low in calories and additionally low in carbs and gluten-free. And they, a lot of the early bottles had, or not bottles, but cans. A lot of the early packaging had pictures of fruit on it or blah, blah, blah. And they sort of try to give off this impression that these were a healthy drink compared to like beer or wine. And then they were generally lower in calories than a comparable serving of beer or wine. Okay, although they came about via a change in Ttb regulations, they weren't completely unprecedented. The sort of more recent predecessors to them are things like Zima, Smirnoff Ice, Mike's Hard Lemonade, Not Your Father's Root Beer. Okay, but the difference was these were all sweet, very sweet beverages. They used to label them alcohol pops. And so these were very high calorie things, and these were generally brewed as an IRC malt beverage, not an IRC beer. After the first wave of sort of quote unquote classic hard seltzers, there were some successors, you could say. What followed next, there were some that were higher in sugar, there were some that added real fruit, and there were some that are higher in alcohol. It's interesting that a lot of breweries, including the Alaskan brewery, craft breweries who got in on the hard seltzer game, they did taste tests with consumers, and they found that the higher in sugar the hard seltzers were, the more that the consumers liked the taste of them. But then if they asked them to choose between hard seltzers that had 90, 100, or 110 calories, they picked 90 calories every time, even though those would be the lowest in sugar. So when you go to a store, you can't immediately taste the hard seltzer, but you can see they generally put the calorie count in large numbers on the can. So they're sold almost entirely on the idea that these are healthy, low calorie, low carb, gluten free, blah blah blah. There are actual Facebook groups and other social media groups devoted to these, and none of the discussion is like, wow, this really tastes good. It's like, wow, I went to the beach and got hammered. So they're fizzy belch water is what they are. And they've, for 2 years, they did very, very well. Probably the most interesting thing, I think, about the history of hard seltzers is that prior to the introduction of hard seltzers, no consumer ever said, what would be great? A hard seltzer. It's just, nobody said that. What happened was a tax loophole opened up, and somebody jumped in and filled that tax loophole, and the rest followed. So there's more about that in my book, but yeah, it's basically brewers found a way to, and brewers had for years tried to make some sort of cocktails in a can sort of thing, with mostly no success. And this was the first sort of big home run by them. Okay, so in order to make I'll give a very brief rundown of the entire process, and then we'll go back and go sort of step by step through it. But in order to make a hard seltzer, what you first do is you ferment a sugar wash that produces a solution of alcohol and water, and some residual sugar, whatever the yeast doesn't finish. Okay, second, you need to strip the solution of any colors, any haze, any odors. So you essentially make a clear, colorless, odorless, except for the smell of alcohol, base beverage. Okay, and then you add the flavors to it. The typical flavors in a hard seltzer are fruit flavors. Then they're usually back sweetened very slightly, and a small amount of the appropriate acid should be added to make to balance the beverage. And finally, they're carbonated, and they're typically canned what the industry calls sleek cans. It's those long, you've seen them. Anyway, so that's a very brief overview of the entire process. So let's go back to the beginning and start with a more nuts and boltsy explanation of how this works. Okay, so if you're a commercial brewery trying to brew an IRC beer, you'd start with a solution of either glucose, corn sugar, or sucrose, which is cane or beet sugar, and water. Okay, and in commercial breweries, they don't brew it at working strength. They brew a high gravity solution, usually 18 to 22 bricks, and then they dilute it to working strength later. Okay, bricks, if you don't know, it's similar to Play-Doh. It's a measure of the sugar content, and specifically it's the percent of sucrose in a solution. So for hard seltzers, it's a highly accurate measure of the weight of the must, which is the equivalent of wort when you're making wine. Okay, so one interesting thing about a sugar wash, which is just sugar and water, is that sugar itself it's not acidic, it's not like basic or alkaline, it's not a buffer. So when fermentation occurs, beer yeast give off lactic acid, which makes the pH lower, in a beer fermentation. But in a beer fermentation, there are a lot of buffers in solution that slow that down. In a sugar and water solution, there's none there, so the pH drops like a rock during fermentation, and there's consequences to that I'll get in later. Okay, and also just as a side note, in some states they don't allow IRC beers. You have to brew an IRC malt beverage, and so in those cases you would have to add 25% malt. And usually when that's done, the brewers usually add chit malt. If you know what that is, it's a very lightly kilned version of malt. It's barely even malt. And then they use enzymes to degrade all the starches in it. So that depends on state regulations. So once you have a sugar solution made up either from just sugar and water, or and to jump, there was a question that you guys sent me earlier. Someone said, why not just add vodka to soft seltzer? Okay, you can go straight to that and be done in a second. But commercial breweries, when they make this, they're making it to get it at a lower tax rate. If they would just take a big vat of soft seltzer, add a bunch of Nutri-Grain spirits to it, they would be taxed at a much higher rate than they would if they go through the whole rigmarole of brewing this. So that's why they would want to brew it. Why a home brewer would want to brew it is an entirely different question. The only thing I can think of is, either you like the stuff or it's a challenge. I've had a number of home brewed hard seltzers, and I'd have to say it's a thing that sort of separates the wheat from the chaff. Like if you can brew a good hard seltzer at home, you're a good home brewer. You've mastered enough of the technical knowledge, to do something like impressive in some sense. Okay, so anyway, once you've made your sugar solution, no matter how you've made it, it's quickly boiled. In the case of beer, there's a number of things that need to be accomplished in the boil. In the case of a hard seltzer boil, all you need to do is sanitize the solution. There's no hot break to precipitate or anything like that. So very short boil. Actually, the boil might blow off some volatiles if there's any impurities in the sugar or whatever. But very short boil. And again, in some states, if you have to brew it as an IRC malt beverage, you're required to add hops. And the interesting thing about the Ttb regulation, or the state regulations, are that none of them specify anything beyond hops. So they don't have to be fresh hop cones. And in fact, a lot of breweries just take hop detritus from previous fermentations. They just rinse it until there's no color or flavor left in it, and throw those in the fermentation to satisfy that requirement. So there's no they don't contribute any flavor. They don't contribute anything to the process. They don't do anything other than check off a box for the taxes. To me, kind of funny. So anyway, and other brewers have been known to use actual leaves or the actual stems from hops. They're hops, but they're not the part that you would use to brew a beer. It's just a way to get around the regulations. Okay, so you boil it. Next comes fermentation, and that's the most difficult part of making a decent hard seltzer. And this is mostly due to yeast nutrition. Okay, when you have sugar and water alone, there's a carbon source, the sugar, for the yeast, but there's nothing else. There's no nutrition at all in the mix. So most beer strains require at least 250 to 300 parts per million, what's called yeast available nitrogen, to ferment well. Okay, and that's yeast available nitrogen is just types of nitrogen that the yeast can take in and utilize. And the thing is, in plain sugar and water, there's absolutely zero nitrogen, 0.000. It's water, H2O, and it's sugar, C6H12O6. There's no N in there anywhere. So a sort of nice thing about brewing hard seltzers is if you know what the yeast requirement is for your yeast strain, you can just add that you don't have to worry about how much is already in there. Like winemakers have to do, or they don't have to, but many of them, they send out their wine to, or their grape juice to a lab that tells them how much nitrogen they have in it, then they add enough to get the yeast to ferment well. But in a hard seltzer, you don't need to know how much nitrogen there is in a sugar wash because there's zero. Okay, so then you need to add yeast nutrients. Okay, and you can add DAP, which is diammonium phosphate. It's used in wine fermentations all the time for the nutrients, but yeast need more than just carbon and nitrogen. They also need zinc and calcium and this whole range of things. But most companies that manufacture yeast, or at least ones that manufacture yeast nutrients, make what's called a complete, yeast and nutrient, and it's got everything you need in there. And then all you have to do is add the right amount to the, fermentation, and that'll give complete nutrition to the yeast. In practice, most brewers of hard seltzers use mostly a complete yeast nutrient with a little bit of a kicker from DAP. They add, on a homebrew scale, 5 gallons of hard seltzer, most of the time a quarter ounce of complete yeast nutrients, the kind that like White Yeast sells, or White Lab sells, or any of the other yeast companies sell. Quarter ounce of that plus just like literally like a pinch of DAP, and that should be enough to get you through the fermentation. Now you have a choice of yeast strains when you ferment a hard seltzer, and a lot of people seem to be convinced that there's a small amount of yeast strains that can do it, and that's simply not the case. You can use most beer strains, most wine strains. You can use distiller's yeast. Among commercial brewers, Lalaman's CBC1 is a very popular choice, but you can use anything if you just know, if you know what the required YAN is, and just use complete yeast nutrients, and just try a couple small batches to get the as a commercial scale, you'd want to try a couple small batches at different concentrations, especially since you would be doing a high gravity fermentation, and you just figure out what the yeast need, and that's it. Just as with brewing beer, you need to pitch an appropriate amount of yeast. You need to aerate, and in both cases, your targets are pretty much right where they would be for brewing beer. Roughly 1 million cells per milliliter per degree Plato, or well, in this case, it'd be degree Brix, and 6 to 8 parts per million oxygen. That's in the ballpark of what you need. If you're doing a high commercial breweries do a high gravity fermentation. A second shot of oxygen is something that most of them do, and it's a good idea. You aerate the sugar wash first before you pitch the yeast, and then right around high corrosion, hit it with the second shot of oxygen. That's going to, of course, as you know, that's going to just make diacetyl levels go through the roof. But that early in fermentation, the yeast will reabsorb most of them at the end, unless it's an extremely poor yeast for reabsorbing diacetyl. Okay, so the biggest problems that people have in fermenting hard seltzer are, leaving it with inadequate nutrition and having a sluggish fermentation. People I don't understand it, but in the early days, people were just trying to ferment sugar washes, and they just wouldn't do the proper trials to figure out how much yeast nutrients to add. And so I got emails all the time like, oh, my fermentation is stuck. Yeah, well, of course it is. But anyway, so the sluggish or stuck fermentation is very common if you haven't taken care of nutrition. And one of the signs that a fermentation is really struggling is a fermentation of a simple sugar wash where the yeast are really struggling. It's going to give off a lot of hydrogen sulfide. It's going to smell like rotten eggs, and that's a huge clue to get some more yeast nutrition into your mix. It's also possible some people took it the other way and added, thought, well, if a little bit of yeast nutrition is good, more is better. And, it is possible to sort of supercharge a fermentation, and that causes its own problems. Most of the problems come from the yeast divide too many times, and then there's a big crash and they die, and they leave you with sort of yeast lysis related flavors. Okay, so if you have enough initial yeast nutrients, if you've got that balance or whatever, finishing the fermentation can still be a problem. The biggest problem is that the pH is going to drop below 3.5, and then almost any beer yeast and even a lot of wine yeast are going to start to struggle, and they're not going to make it through. So what you need to do is monitor your pH, and as it starts getting near 3.5, add a bit of something that's going to absorb the acid. Potassium bicarbonate is a good pH or a good way to do that, to raise the pH, and just continually do that, and keep the yeast sitting fermenting at 3.6, 3.7 pH, and then they'll chug through the rest of it. But if you let them drop a little bit too far below 3.5, they really start to struggle and are just gonna drop out. Just standard things to finish a beer fermentation also work. Stir the tank to rouse the yeast and raise the temperature a little bit. That can help you finish off a fermentation. If it's struggling early in fermentation, adding more yeast nutrients might be the thing to do, but you can't add them late in fermentation, because then if there's residual yeast nutrients kicking around, that'll set the stage for contaminants to grow in the hard seltzer, and you don't want that. Also, don't aerate late. If you aerate late in the game, you will stimulate the yeast, and it'll probably finish faster, but you'll also have a lot of diacetyl in your fermented sugar wash, which is harder to remove than a lot of other things. Okay, so when you do finish fermentation, it should be at negative 1.8 to negative 2 Brix, depending on your starting gravity. The higher your starting gravity, the lower your finishing gravity should be. And you're all, I'm sure, aware that the density of ethanol is like 0.7 something compared to the density of water, which is defined as 1.0. So any mix of adding ethanol to water is going to lower the specific gravity from 1.000 to lower levels, 0.99699 whatever. So your terminal gravity should be in the negative Brix because of the presence of ethanol. Okay, so now you fermented the sugar wash. You've supplied the yeast with enough nutrition. You've taken care of the pH problem, and you've got a fermented sugar wash. The next thing you need to do is clear that up. You need to remove any off flavors, aromas, and colors. It should basically, when you're done, it should be clear. The only smell you should be able to smell is the smell of ethanol, and it should be colorless. And if you're a big brewery doing this, they use nanofiltration or reverse osmosis, and that just strips the sugar wash down to just a clear, brilliantly clear alcoholic substance. Sort of medium-sized production breweries, they'll do filtration through activated carbon, and that does a very good job of cleaning it up, both any particulates and also any flavors or odors. Brew pubs are a little bit more limited. They sometimes don't have the filtration equipment to do all that. And one option for them is to fine with activated carbon, although this can be very messy. And you need to be, if you're a brew pub and you're going to try to make a hard seltzer, you've got to pay attention to what sort of, there's different grades of activated carbon. And you want to pick one of the coarser ones that's going to drop out quickly, because the finer ones will stay in suspension forever and sort of leave a gray haze in the beer, which isn't going to go over well with customers or anybody. And then it might really require filtration to remove, which is what you were trying to avoid in the first place by fining instead of filtering the beer. So one thing that all breweries can do is, if it's otherwise clear and flavorless, but there's a weird aroma to it, which there can be, just bubbling CO2 through the base should take care of that. The bubbles will knock any volatiles out, and you can do that. But the one caveat is you need to degas the solution a little bit first. At the end of fermentation, your solution is going to be saturated with CO2 at whatever pressure it's under. And if you start bubbling CO2 through it, that's just going to knock CO2 out of solution, and you're going to have, like at a homebrew scale, if you did it in a carboy, you're just going to have like a hard seltzer volcano. It's just going to shoot up and hit your ceiling, and you lose all that. So if you're going to bubble CO2 through, make sure to degas it first, and then start very slowly. And as you might expect, given that you need to clean up the base solution, your best bet is to try to make it as clean and colorless as possible from the start. And again, that's going to have to do with getting the right amount of yeast nutrition, pitching the right amount of yeast, getting proper aeration, and just shepherding the fermentation through by keeping the pH in the right range. And that'll make it easier to clean up later. As a home brewer, if you're trying it, if you're brewing one at working strength, if you're going to make a 5% one, and you're making like a 5% alcohol solution rather than say a 10% that you're going to dilute to 5 later, it's actually pretty easy to make a reasonably clear, reasonably colorless, odorless solution. And then you can, if you want to say that's good enough, or you can say, I'll use some extremely coarse activated carbon, clear up the worst of it, and call it good. And it can really be like not just say like, oh, it's close as I can get it. You can actually do a pretty good job as a home brewer that way if you're fermenting at working strength. Okay, so after you've brewed the beverage, or brewed the base, you've cleaned it up, the next step is adding the flavors to it. And okay, this is done in several steps. First, if you've brewed high gravity, it's diluted to working strength with deaerated water. It needs deaerated water. It is water that as the phrase implies, the air has been removed from, so there's no oxygen in it. So anything in the hard seltzer which could be oxidized won't be oxidized. It's actually less critical in hard seltzer. than in beers. In beers, there's a lot of things that can be oxidized, and the breweries that do high gravity fermentations have, they go to great lengths to deaerate the water. And the thing is, a lot of hard seltzer breweries do too, but then they're generally just relying on their beer equipment to do that. Okay, so anyway, they dilute to working strength, and if you took chemistry, the equation C1 V1 equals C2 V2, concentration on volume equals concentration times volume. That'll tell you how to dilute whatever you have to the correct working strength. Okay, so then the next thing is that flavor extracts are added. And for the big commercial breweries, these are all artificial. They're huge flavor houses that make and package, flavor extracts, and they're also given Ttb and FDA regulations and all that. There's restrictions on what you can put and what you can't put in there. But the flavor, the companies that make the flavor extracts, of course, are on top of that, and they'll tell you if you're a commercial brewery, this is approved for hard seltzers at this concentration or what. There's all sorts of weird quirks to it. Like if you're making a hard seltzer that's less than 6% ABV, up to 49% of the alcohol in it can come from the flavor extracts, because some of the flavor extracts contain the flavor is dissolved in ethanol. So in that case, the sugar wash you're fermenting might not have to really give that much alcohol to the final product, because you're just going to add it with the flavor. But over 6%, then only about 1.5% can come from the flavor extracts. So, and the types of flavor extracts that show up most often in hard seltzers are usually there's like a lot of citrus fruits, there's a lot of stone fruits, and secondarily to that there's some flower extracts, but it's largely a fruit sort of fruit flavor at a very low level. Okay, so part of the flavor, perception of any fruit is dependent on the acids that come with it. Citrus fruits, of course, have citric acid as the acid in them that gives them a little bit of tartness. Stone fruits have malic acid in them, which gives them their characteristic taste, or as part of it. Grapes have tartaric acid. So if you're making a hard seltzer, depending on the flavor extract, because a lot of flavor extracts come pre-blended with that, but you may want to adjust the acidity and the flavor of the acidity with the appropriate acid. You also want to hit a fairly low final pH once you've mixed all the flavors and the sweeteners and everything in. Most hard seltzers come in at a pH of around 3.1, which is pretty low. It's in a low wine range, and that both gives them the sort of a crispness, and it also gives them a little bit of biological stability. They're pasteurized afterwards, but a low pH is going to give them it gives them a fighting chance of keeping any contaminants at bay. Okay, so finally in the blending stage, there's also back sweetening. The point of hard seltzers is that they're low in calories and low in carbs, but most of them have a little bit of sugar added, just because if they were completely devoid of sugar, they would be awful or more awful, depending on your point of view. So anyway, a lot of them are back sweetened with the sort of classic hard seltzers, all advertised at less than 2 grams of sugar, or 2 grams of added sugar per 12 ounces, which is a low amount. So if a brewery's back sweetening, they need to stabilize the beverage after that. For commercial breweries, that of course means pasteurization. If you're doing it as a home brewer, you probably don't have a pasteurizer at your house. So what you would do is add potassium sorbate. If you're kegging, add potassium sorbate, and then keg the beer and cool it down. And potassium sorbate is something that the winemakers use when they back sweeten wines, and it stops the yeast from fermenting. It doesn't kill them actually, but it just stops them from fermenting. And so if you keg a hard seltzer at home with back sweetening, a little bit of potassium sorbate will allow you to do that. Then you force carb it. Okay, and then so the last stage is carbonation. Hard seltzers are very carbonated. They're usually 2.8 volumes of CO2, and this compares to like craft beers, and American Pilsners are 2.5, 2.6 volumes of CO2. So hard seltzers are like 2.8, which is a little higher. It's lower than like champagne can go up to like 6 volumes of CO2, which of course explosively can erupt when you open a bottle. But 2.8, it's a pretty fizzy beverage. Most for commercial brewers, excuse me, they sort of decided early on that the sleek cans, the sort of taller 12-ounce cans, are what they would package it in as a home brewer. You can't get those, so that doesn't matter. And one of the weird things that the commercial brewers have to worry about, given that they've got a very low pH beverage, highly carbonated, is they need a liner inside the can that will avoid corrosion. And at first that was a problem. Breweries had to sort of hunt around and take some guesses, but now, the industry's been around enough that the can makers know what liners are appropriate. And finally, for a commercial brewery, the last step would be, once it's canned and everything, would be something like tunnel pasteurization, where it's heated briefly, kill off almost all the contaminating microorganisms. And so that's the entire process. At home, you can actually make a really respectable hard seltzer if you try. It takes some skill. If you've ever made mead before, that really helps, because mead is you make honey and water, and that's a very low nitrogen level, very low level of yeast nutrients, and the sort of things you learn from mead making, including staggered nutrient additions and the need for pH management with potassium bicarbonate and things, will help you out a lot. You're just taking it like to the sort of ultimate test of like starting out with just no yeast nutrients, nothing, no buffers at all to counteract pH changes. So anyway, if anyone has any questions, please ask. Also, as you mentioned, I wrote a book on this.
We know.
They asked me to write the book, by the way. I didn't say, oh my God, I love hard seltzers, I got to write about this.
Hang on just a second.
Sure.
So I had a quick question about boiling or not. Now, you mentioned boiling, but I'm wondering, is there any real reason to bring it to a boil versus just heating to like 180, 185?
Yeah, that's a good question. You could sanitize it that way. I think the reason that most brewers bring it to an actual boil is just on the chance that there's any sort of weird aromatics in the mix, that a little bit of boil will blow that off. But yeah, you could just bring the mix up to like 170 degrees Fahrenheit and hold it there for 5 minutes, and that should sanitize it.
I think one of the questions that came in from folks before the meeting was regarding how to ensure you keep color out of the process, and maybe we already just answered that with a low temperature versus a boil. But any tips on that?
Yeah, if you're making it at home, if you're making it at working strength, like boiling you know, a 5%, a solution that's going to make 5% ABV of just sugar and water, you shouldn't really pick up that much color unless you're, you know, you've got a real hot spot on your kettle or something. So, you know, just don't go nuts boiling. And you really, the amount of, on a homebrew scale, the amount of color you pick up should be negligible. If you're trying to homebrew do high gravity and you know, you've got a very hot burner, you might have some problems, but it shouldn't really. I mean, the amount of in a sugar wash, which is just sugar and water, you're not going to have any Maillard reactions going on. So those aren't going to contribute to it, and you're really not going to at you know, the amount of sugar that you have to make a, you know, base of 5% ABV, you're not going to be able to get the solution hot enough to start caramelizing sugars. So yeah, just it should not be an issue as a homebrewer.
Okay, thanks.
Chris, I have a question on fruit additions. You know, what's been your experience on how to approach that? What's worked well for you?
Well, it's worked well for me by not trying to brew one of these things because I just found it better. But of people who do, just all the rules that you've learned for brewing fruit beers, or if you're a winemaker, you know, adding fruits to grape wines, apply. I would say, you know, if you, once you got your sugar wash fermented, cleaned up, adding just fruit puree, which is sanitary, adding the proper amount to it, and then just letting it re-ferment, that should work. And that's, and you know, I know a lot of homebrewers have tried it that way. Yeah, it should, all the standard, if you've made a fruit beer, all the standard things you do there should apply for hard seltzer.
Great, thanks.
And also you'll be adding a lot less fruit, so you know, the you've got sort of a higher tolerance for small things going wrong.
For the water, does it matter what kind of minerality is it? Do they use RO for it, or they build up a certain amount of calcium chloride and any others?
Yeah, since it's mostly water, you know, a classic hard seltzer ends up being, you know, 95% water, 5% ethanol, and, you know, traces of other things. The water's got to taste good. So it's mostly, yeah, water treated with a little bit of calcium chloride and or gypsum, just so it tastes good, you know. That's really, you know, you don't have to worry about having calcium in your water for a mash. You don't have to worry about really almost anything else. You just, as long as the water tastes good, then you're fine, and you can adjust the taste of your water a little bit with, you know, starting out with a very low, you know, a low mineral content, and just adding a little bit of calcium chloride or gypsum.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I'm gonna, I mentioned earlier, Chris, that you are not a one-trick pony.
No.
And so I wanted to give you the opportunity to tell us a little bit about yourself and your other, the books that you've written, and anything else you want to talk about.
Yeah, I've written a couple other brewing books. One, the first one was just called the Homebrew Recipe Bible. This place contacted me and wanted a recipe book, and so I made it's a book of, it's got like 101 recipes in it, and each recipe has a little discussion of the techniques or something, or the ingredients or something about the beer. And then I wrote another one called Methods of Modern Homebrewing, which I thought was great, but nobody else did. The publisher didn't really push it that hard, and it never sold that well. But it's a great book, I think. And it's going on a print, but it's still available on Amazon, and you can see it in bookstores sometimes. Yeah, and then I wrote another book recently, this one for Brewers Publication, and I told them exactly what the book was going to be, and they said, "Oh yeah, it sounds good." And then I turned in the exact book I told them. And then they said, wow, this is really good, but yeah, we can't publish this. And I was like, what? So I did get paid in advance for it, but and that book is it's the history of beer. I start at the Big Bang and work my way through cosmic inflation, stellar formation, the CNO cycle, planet formation, evolution, and
Well, if you're going for beer history, probably starting at the beginning is a good idea with a Big Bang.
start at the very beginning. Yeah. Yeah,
Wow.
James Michener used to start books where, like, a bird would arrive on an island and shit out a seed or whatever. I one up that and started at the Big Bang. So, and it's I don't know. It's I'm gonna try to release the book myself somehow, but that's pretty fun.
We have
And then I also other stuff. I don't know. I raised monarch butterflies.
Good on you. My goodness.
Yeah, it's fun. I 2 years ago, I raised 77 during the spring, which is a pretty big number. And this coming year, I set a goal to raise 240. Wow. And I've upped my milkweed plantings and other native flowers to bring in the insects, and so we'll see. I think it's going to come down to luck. I've got the milkweed biomass, and I've got flowers blooming at 3 different heights throughout the entire visit, or the entire period of time that monarchs should be coming through my area. So we'll see.
That sounds really, really cool. Thanks for sharing that.
No problem.
So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, and cheers to Chris. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for inviting me.
We really appreciate
we're
your time tonight.
Were we going to taste hard seltzers at one point?
We've been tasting them all through your presentation.
I actually bought one today.
Which one did you get?
Topo Chico Lemon Lime.
Okay.
Topo Chico is it's a brand of Mexican sparkling water. It's like a super fizzy water, and then they decided to make a hard seltzer. So I was curious.
Yeah. Yeah, we've been partaking while you've been talking, trying to be unobtrusive.
Yeah, it's weird. They're I think the best description of a hard seltzer came from Ashton Lewis. He was the brewer at Springfield Brewing, blah, blah, blah. And he told me once drinking a hard seltzer is like drinking TV static while someone says the name of a fruit in the next room, and that's kind of it. It's just like fizzy, and you're like, is that strawberry? What the hell is that? And I mean, and they're absolutely just designed to get people drunk. That's all they're doing. There's no, like I said, there are social media groups that discuss these beverages, and there's never a discussion on like, oh, I really enjoyed the presentation of the fruit in this. No, it's just like, dude, I was at the beach and I was wasted. So that's who they're selling them to, and and also people who, I don't know, thinking drinking is more healthy than beer or wine. And I mean, there's less calories, so that's, I guess, in that respect, they're healthier than beer or wine. But there's so many variables when you're dealing with health that I wouldn't say that lower calories necessarily makes it more healthy.
So with the target of being or getting wasted, not that there's anything wrong with that.
No.
Anyway, thank you so much, Chris. Really appreciate it, man. Thanks for joining us. Hey, if you want to, Chris, if you want to stick around, another Chris Banker, who is the brewer at Barrel and Stave, is going to tell us a little bit about the 2 seltzers that we served during the tail end of your presentation.
Okay, cool. I'll go get my Topo Chico hard seltzer out of the fridge. Enjoy that. Well,
Okay. Thanks, man.
okay, back in a second.
So I will mention that I did buy Chris's book prior to making seltzers, and that was like one of my first purchases for the brewery, was getting that so I could read up on making seltzers and plan out my plan of attack. So you got to try the 2 seltzers that we've got on tap right now as part of your opening lineup at Barrel and Stave. And one of those we call Full of Passion, which is a passion fruit seltzer using real passion fruit. And then the other one is Clearly Creamsicle, which is an orange creamsicle seltzer using real orange zest and Madagascar vanilla beans. Yeah, so I set out to make the best darn hard seltzers I could. I wanted to make some because it's a market you really can't ignore. Even though there's been a little bit of downturn, it's still a really hot market. And that can earn me some money to help afford some more expensive beers and make give me some margins on some of the other stuff I want to make. So I set out to not leave that market ignored, but also make something that I'd be willing to drink. I really wanted to make great seltzer, not just something that was a commodity to get out there, but make something actually great that I would be happy to drink and proud to serve. So I knew I wanted to use real fruit in it. I didn't want to mess around with artificial flavors, or even the natural flavors are allowed to contain like 0.1% top note, which can be artificial, and that's so strong that they're basically artificial. So anyway, the process to this, I made a 20-barrel batch of it as 2 10-barrel runs. So instead of trying to kind of guess the moving parts, I did it as 2 10-barrel runs, but the whole double brew day, including cleanup, was probably 6 hours versus more than twice that long for a beer brew day. So for water, I start with our reverse osmosis water for everything. And for this one, I use the Brew and Water Yellow Balanced Profile. Just to have something flavorful, something that's not too bland as a starting point. So I added mineral additions to achieve that yellow balanced profile from Brew and Water. And then I heated up the water. I just ran hot liquor tank water at 180 into my boil kettle and mixed in the sugar and the nutrients and whirlpooled it and heated it a little bit just to get it to about 180, held it for a few minutes, and then knocked out through the heat exchanger with oxygen. And for yeast, I used this turbo yeast called TY Pure from Pathfinder in the UK. It's probably not available to homebrewers in homebrew quantities, but I figured I wasn't going to be making back-to-back seltzers. It'll be a while before we need to make more. So it was going to be a throwaway yeast anyway, so might as well use something with a properly built nutrient profile, and it's available in dry pouches, so I was able to just use that for the yeast. It had all the nutrients built in. I definitely needed to add some of the potassium bicarbonate additions to get the pH up, because it did get down well below 3.5, and I had to give it a couple additions to keep it up there. So that was something helpful from Chris's book. And if anyone needs a little bit of that, a pinch of that for the homebrew scale, let me know and I can get a pinch of you from the brewery. Let's see, so after a full fermentation, I cold crashed it, got it as clear as I could, but without using any finings on it. And it was pretty clear with a little bit of haze to it. Then I did 2 stages of filtration using a 30-inch membrane filter. It's like a sanitary stainless version of one of the water filters a lot of us use for homebrewing, but 30 inches tall with pressure gauges on it and dry clamps and everything. So I ran from that initial 20-barrel tank into another clean, bright tank through a pre-filter. That was a 3-micron poly filter, and so that stripped out all the haze. It was crystal clear and colorless on the other side of that. Then I pushed it back into the other tank through a 5-micron carbon filter. So this is a carbon block filter, and so you push that through pretty slowly. It's over the course of a few hours at 3 gallons a minute. And then at that point, it was totally colorless, totally flavorless, tasted like water with a splash of vodka in it. Super clean at that point. Then from there, I split it into 2 tanks. So I had 10 barrels in each tank, and then did my fruit additions. For the fruits, I tried a lot of different fruits, and I really fell in love with the products from Perfect Puree of Napa Valley. They've got some really good fruits. They're not fully pasteurized. They're not considered aseptic, but they are clean. So there's a small amount of risk there, but it's pretty minimal, and a lot of people use these very successfully. But the main thing is they've got a much more natural flavor. The passion fruit, I grow my own passion fruit. This was the only passion fruit product that I had tasted that tasted exactly like my homegrown passion fruit. So I used, for the 10-barrel batch of the passion fruit, I used 80 pounds of that passion fruit concentrate, and it comes in these little like 1.5-pound jars, so it was like 100 of them. Yeah, my brewer is like out there on the ladder dumping them all in. Actually, I think the passion fruit we pushed in through a brink. We dumped it all into a yeast brink, and there was a whole snafu getting the fruit. We ordered it from Specialty Produce. They said it's all good, and it was supposed to be out for delivery. And then I called them asking where it was, and they said, "Oh yeah, we didn't actually have that, so we didn't send it." So then I called Moseri Produce, and they said, "Yes, but we've got to have it shipped down from Napa. We'll have it shipped down overnight and get it out to you tomorrow morning." And so they had it. I get a call from them, "Your doors are all locked and there's no one here." And I tell them, "What do you mean there's a dozen people here and all the doors are wide open?" And I have them, and they had already left. I tell them, "Okay, come back and try again." And they say they're there, and they had gone to our other location in Vista Village, and that doesn't open until 11 a.m. So they brought it in the wrong. Eventually, while this was all going on, someone showed up to open there, and they dropped it. And then they tried to come back and take it, and at Vista Village they said, "No, we'll drive it over ourselves." We didn't want to lose it. So it was a hassle, and it was not cheap using real fruit, especially on this scale if you're not buying whole pallets. But that's basically the story on getting the fruit. So for the passion fruit, we did just the passion fruit concentrate in that. For the orange one, I used, I believe it was 12 ounces of Madagascar vanilla beans. And the process I use for that is I chop them up into little bits, put them in some water, and bring them to about 180, 190 on the stove, and then cool it off and dump it in. And that gets you a lot of extraction in the water and doesn't deal with any of the TTP hassles of adding alcohol and having to do a formula approval on it. Technically, vanilla extract is not allowed, and you've got to do a formula approval to even use that. So this gets some good extraction, and you give it some contact time on the vanilla beans as well as that short extraction in water. And then it was the orange zest that Perfect Puree makes. So they provide a orange zest product. That's none of the fruit, none of the pith, just the zest. It's really tasty, really flavorful, imparts almost no color. I mean, you can see that clearly creamsicle was almost clear, had just a little bit of orange oil haze. So that's about it on those. I carbonated up to about 2.8 on those, and they're serving off the kegs. I think I saw someone with a question. David. The question was whether I would do it again. I assume you're talking about the real fruit. Yeah, absolutely. It turned out so well. I need to figure out getting the passion fruit cheaper, either buying in larger bulk or group buys or something, because it was kind of cost prohibitive in those amounts. The orange zest was less than half as much, and so that was in a reasonable price range and kind of more reasonable for that scale. But I think they do sell larger boxes if you get your special order in a lot in advance. You can get like 50 or 60 pound boxes of it. Yeah, Chris? Chris's question was what kind of sugar. This was dextrose, corn sugar. Yeah, it's supposed to be a little bit more fermentable to the yeast without it's less processes the yeast have to go through. And at least on the pro scale, it's very inexpensive in 50-pound sacks. Oh, yeah, Chris.
So you serve this at your brew pub? Is that?
Yeah, at my brewery. We're not packaging it. We're only serving it in kegs. We're not packaging cans.
did you, at 2.8 volumes of CO2, did you have to rebalance your lines at all, or did you just sort of run it at the same pressure that you
We've been able to get it to serve pretty well without rebalancing them.
Cool. Thanks.
I will mention a couple of shameless plugs. If anyone wants to try some other beers from my brewery, stop by anytime, but I will be heading over there after the meeting tonight to do a little bit of work, and so we're open till 10 if you want to check it out after the meeting. Then also, we've been struggling to get Untapped check-ins on these seltzers because people who drink seltzer are not Untapped users. So if you're an Untapped user, feel free to give it a rating, whatever you feel is accurate. You don't need to give 5-star ratings, but that would help us get it to the 10 we need to have it even show up. So if you use Untapped, check in.
Okay, I have one more question for the club. Who thought that Chris's seltzers were the best of the bunch that we tasted tonight? Yeah, that's pretty unanimous. Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, we got one more question or two for Chris Colby.
Hey, Chris. I was just curious, since you wrote the book, what is your favorite hard seltzer, or brand, or just hard seltzer in general?
Oh, I really, like, I'm a writer, and I mean, I've also been a homebrewer for many years, and I wrote the book on hard seltzer because the Brewers Association, or BP, Brewers Publication, approached me and said, hey, do you know anything about hard seltzers? And I said, you know, sort of. And you know, I know people in the industry. And they said, we need a book really quick. And, you know, can you write a book really quick? And I said, well, yes, I can do that. And they said, well, we have some money for that. And I said, I will get you your book. Yeah, so I didn't write the book because I like hard seltzers, and I don't know, there's ones I find, I don't know, there's none that I would buy, like if I was ever in the beer aisle, you know, and like oh, I want a hard seltzer. That would never happen. If I was at like a party of Brohams and then people like, they had all these hard seltzers, I'd probably go for some of the Truly stuff isn't too bad. Some of the black cherry ones aren't so bad, but yeah, it's funny. I did a video for Craft Beer and Brewing, which is a magazine, and they have these little, on their website, they have little, you know, brewing things, and I did a how to brew hard seltzer thing, and then at the end they were like, hey, like, you're the expert. We got this. They had this whole cooler full of hard seltzers, and like, why don't you try all these on camera and say, you know, how you like them? And I was just like, oh, you guys, this is going to be death. This is not what you know, this is not going to turn out how you want it to. But they're like, no, go ahead. And so I tried all these hard seltzers, and I said, that was average. That was average. And then there was one I opened up, and it like shot. It was like way over carbonated. It shot up. It splashed everyone. I said, well, that was well carbonated. That's probably the highlight of that.
Well, I'd have to say that you might have enjoyed Chris Banker's just a little bit more. The real fruit flavors and everything is really, really nice for a seltzer.
Probably.
For a seltzer.
I know there's a homebrewer from Houston, and she's I know her, and was planning to open a commercial brewery, and she brought me some hard seltzers she made with, one of them was with I forget, some sort of Mexican sugar, one of those and another one with some actual fruit, and yeah, those are very good. I mean, the reasons that commercial hard seltzers are just so unimpressive is because they're brewed to be that way. You know, if you wanted to take a hard seltzer and do something good with it, you could, but it's just that there's no incentive for the commercial. Excuse me, I just had one and I burped. There's no incentive for the commercial brewers to you know, the big commercial brewers to do it, because people, that's not what they're looking for. They're just looking for something to get drunk on and low calories.
Okay, Chris, I have a question for you regarding fermentation. Being that there's no malt or very little malt, it's all sugars. What about temperature control? And if you're using a distiller's yeast, can you go pretty high, like maybe 85, 90, to ferment products sort of like agave?
Yeah, here's the thing. You generally with yeast, the higher you go, the more esters they produce, the more fermentation byproducts they produce. And in a hard seltzer production, you've got to take out any aromas later. So you got to balance the temperature you ferment at with, like, are you going to be able to scrub out all the aromas later? With something like distiller's yeast, yeah, you can run it pretty hot. And also CBC1 which is what a lot of the big producers use. That one can be run, you can ferment pretty hot. Actually, I did some consulting for a brewery in Peru, and they used USO5, the fermented dried Chico yeast, and they went pretty hot on it, and it worked for them. They were able to get a nice, a relatively clean wash or fermented sugar wash right off the bat, and then do sort of a minimal amount of work to clean it up. So yeah, run the yeast as hot as you can get away with.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? I think that's it, Chris. Again, thank you so much.
I tried this one. Which is good. Tasted like water. Not bad though.
All right, anytime you're in San Diego, please join us if you can. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks for inviting me. And if you ever want to invite me to talk on an interesting topic, I would be happy to.
Hey, Chris, I will reach out to you and we will work something out. Thanks, man.
Awesome.
Appreciate
Sounds
it.
good.
Thank you.